Another sequencing feature that's very unique to Elektron gear is the ability to utilize trig conditions. Now, we've already talked about what a trig is. A trig is basically a note that's been entered into the sequence that will trigger the sound on that track. Trig conditions mean that we can make that trig only trigger that sample under certain conditions. If we go to the trig page, we have a box that says COND, and this is where we can assign trig conditions to certain trigs in our sequence. Now, these may seem a little bit confusing at first, but once you kind of understand the way that it's laid out and sort of worded, I think it'll make a lot of sense to you, and they're very, very fun and useful to utilize. So I'm going to focus on my last two tracks, tracks 7 and 8, in order to explain these. Let me make sure track 7 is selected. Now, right now, there's nothing actually on track 8. Track 8 has this ride cymbal sound. Track 7 has this weird hi-hat-ish kind of sound. Now, let me play the beat. And if we look at the trigs on track 7, to see the trigs, I go into my grid recording mode. And these are my trigs. So this is being triggered once every beat, once every quarter note. Now, if I want to make it so that these trigs only get triggered under certain conditions, under certain criteria, I can hold one of them down, just like we do with parameter locking. And then I just turn the knob under where it says COND, making sure that I'm on my trig page. So I'm going to turn this. And the first trig condition we see is called fill. Now, we have a fill mode that can be enabled by hitting the page button as long as we're not in any sort of recording mode. And what will happen is that any trigs that are assigned to fill will play. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and make it so that all of these are set to fill. Now, what I could do is I could go to each trig and then change that condition. Or we can use our copy and paste functionality. If I want to copy and paste one of my trigs in my sequence, I simply hold that trig down. As I'm holding it, I hit the record button, which will let me copy. I go to the place that I want to copy and paste that. I want to paste it here. I'm going to hold this trig down. Stop button doubles as paste. And now I pasted that trig. It's a very easy way to copy and paste trigs that have certain sample settings, pitch settings, etc. All right, so now if I play this, we see the trigs in the sequence, but we don't hear this sound. If I want to hear these trigs, I have to enable the fill mode. Now again, I have to do that by pressing the page button, but I have to make sure that I'm not in any recording mode. So let me hit recording to get out of this. As soon as I hold the page button down, now I hear the sounds, I let go, and then it stops. Now if I want to activate the fill for just one iteration of the pattern, I can hold yes, and then press the page button, and then the next time it loops, it's going to enable the fill. Okay, so that's the fill mode. Now, if I go to one of these and I'm holding the trig down, if I go past fill mode, we have fill with a line over it. Any trig condition that has a line over it means it's going to do the opposite of what it would normally do. So in this case, if I activate fill mode, this trig will not play. If fill mode is not active, then this trig will play. If I play it right now, the only one that plays is the first one because fill mode is not active. If I get out of my recording mode, I'll activate the fill mode. And now all the other ones play, but this one doesn't play because it had fill with a line over it, which means that when fill mode is active, it's not going to play. The next option, if we go past the fill modes, is pre. What pre will do is that trig will only get triggered if the previous trig that had some sort of trig condition is triggered. That may sound confusing, but it doesn't have to be. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I'm going to set this first one to fill again, and I'm going to go to the next trig, say here, and we're going to set this to pre. This trig is only going to play if the previous trig plays. This trig will only play if I activate the fill mode. If we play this right now, I don't hear anything. I activate the fill mode. This one plays because fill mode is active. This one plays because the previous trig with the trig condition played. All right. And then we also have the opposite of that, which is pre with a line, which means that this trig will play if the previous trig with the trig condition didn't play. If I move beyond that, we have NEI, which stands for neighbor. Now this one's really interesting because it doesn't do anything based on what's happening on this track. It does something based on what's happening on the previous track, the neighboring track. So I think the best way to really get an understanding for this, let's see, all these are set for fill mode, and we're on track 7. I'm going to go to track 8, and track 8 has that other sound on it. I'm going to make it so that we'll enter one of these on the same steps, beats 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm going to change the condition here to neighbor, which means that these trigs are only going to play if track 7 has trigs that are playing on those same steps that have a trig condition. So that's enabled. Let me copy, paste, paste, paste. All right, now if I play this, I don't hear anything on track 7 or track 8. Track 7 won't play unless I activate the fill mode. Track 8 won't play unless those trigs on track 7 are triggered. So when I activate fill, I'm going to hear both 7 and 8. All right. Now where this gets really interesting is if we go back to track 8 and we change these trigs from neighbor to neighbor with a line over it. Because now what this means, let me copy, paste, paste, paste. What this means now is that track 8 will play. But when I activate fill mode, track 7 is going to play trigs on those same steps, and track 8 is not going to play because it's set to not trigger if the neighboring track is triggering trigs on those same steps. So now, my fill mode activates track 7. When I get out of the fill mode, track 7 stops, and track 8 will play. This is going to be a great way to set up some kind of call and response action with your different tracks. Now, after all that, we have some different trig conditions. First just means that it's going to play the first time the pattern plays and it won't play again after that. If we have first with a line, it's going to do the opposite of that. That's pretty self-explanatory. We also have a number of percentages here, so it'll only play a certain percentage of time. And then after that, we have these options here. If it's set to 1, 2, what this means is that for every 2 times the pattern is going to loop, this trig is only going to play on the first iteration of that loop. So in this scenario, this trig would basically play every other time. It would play the first iteration of the loop. It wouldn't play the second time. It would play the third time, and then not the fourth time, etc. If we move beyond here, let's pick something a little bit different. Okay, so 2, 5 means that for every 5 times the pattern loops, this trig will play on the second iteration of the loop, and then every other 5 times, it'll always play on the second iteration of every 5 loops. So you can do some very interesting things by adding various trig conditions that are a combination of these ratios, percentages, and then more specific conditions that are related either to this track or the neighboring track. So using these, you can either add randomization or you can make it so that a 1-bar sequence sounds like it loops over a much longer period of time because maybe each trig is only being triggered 1 out of every 6 loops or 1 out of every 8 different loops. So I definitely encourage you to play around with this, and I'm going to incorporate some trig conditions before we move forward.